So thank you everyone for making the trip. The workshop label has not had the effect of alienating people during the forthright vocalising of their innermost thoughts. As you can see by the programme, the arrangements are not unlike your average academic symposium. That said, I felt workshop was a more fitting name to describe the objective of today. While we're joined by speakers with distinct research interests who are engaged in their own areas of expertise, it's my expectation that we'll take insights from the presentations towards a more collective discussion with a view to developing future practice. As people working in or researching the film industries, I think we all nurture a collaborative ethos and know that in order to make something happen, it must be done as a collective, as part of a wider community, building bridges and dialogues across communities often unlike our own. I borrowed an image which you might be able to see kind of faintly in the background of the title here from Silaj Kasmogori's great documentary from 2019 talking about trees, a film which centres the work of a Sudanese film group comprised of retired filmmakers trying to restore and reopen the cinema in the country's second biggest city. The film was shot in 2015 in the midst of a 22-year-long dictatorship. It documents everyday lives and the desire for the freedom to enjoy the pleasures of culture and entertainment. Omar al-Bashir came to power in the early 1990s following the coup against the democratically elected government of Sadiq al-Mahdi during the civil war in the country. The second civil war following independence from Britain in 1953. The film's release as al-Bashir is overthrown, and it speaks to a community ethos and resilience in the face of impossibility. On its surface, talking about trees is far more about the social value of cinema to a people and its integral role to the wider public memory than it is about conflict and collective trauma. But the film is nonetheless a kind of testimony of the social, political, economic and cultural legacies of colonialism. Behind these post-colonial narratives of resilience and rebuilding lies a history of imperial expansion and neglect. The film represents the kinds of narratives I hope we'll be able to approach today as we consider the relationship between film exhibition and distribution in the wider context of colonial history and decolonial resistance. Today I hope we can share perspectives learned often from our own practices and learn from others who share a common interest in decolonisation. In the UK context, the end of the British Empire was truly underway in the late 1940s with the independence of India and Pakistan, followed in the 1960s with decolonisation throughout Africa and the Caribbean, through to Hong Kong in 1997. But it's the afterlife of colonialism, the cultural and political nostalgia for empire, the social and economic legacies left behind in former colonies, which makes decolonisation more than a historical concept. It is in fact something that is just as pressing as it has ever been. I'm led in this sense by the work of Walter Mignolo, whose writings on coloniality have been instrumental in the theorisation of decolonisation. I want to quote at some length from the book he co-authors with Catherine Walsh in response to the question, what does it mean to decolonise? So Mignolo argues there's no master plan and no privileged actors for decoloniality. There are certainly scales in the intensity of colonial wounds. Decoloniality is a multifaceted global enterprise in the hands of the people who act and organise themselves/ourselves as decolonial thinkers, actors and doers. By conceiving of coloniality as a complex structure of management and control, one grasps that it is the underlying structure of Western civilization and of Eurocentrism, and that fully understanding how it works is a necessary condition for delinking from coloniality. In order to do so, it is necessary to think and act decolonially, both in the analysis of the colonial matrix of power, so delinking subjectively and programmatically from it, and by engaging with projects and organisations that run parallel and in the same direction. Decolonial delinking, Mignolo says, cannot be done all at once, but shall focus on specific domains, levels and flows of the colonial matrix of power and their relations with the rest. There is no master plan led by a privileged elite, avant-garde intellectuals, or ego-identity politics that can do the job, nor can it be done via state politics and regulation. Instead, it requires a political structure of governance that supports people's organisations and creativity that could be thought of as part of a communal decolonial horizon. In the second decade of the 21st century, the number of organisations denying the authority of the colonial matrix of power and the empty promises of the rhetoric of modernity is growing around the planet. The horizon of doing needs horizons of thinking, which at the same time requires the actuality of doing. Indeed, delinking today follows two routes: decoloniality and de-westernisation. In both cases, although to different ends, epistemic and emotional and aesthetic delinking means conceiving of and creating institutional organisations that are at the service of life and do not, as in the current state of affairs, put people at the service of institutions. Decolonial being, thinking and doing begins with such assumptions. And that's quite there, it's quite a long one. So I quite at length though to do several things. First, to recognise Mignola's writing as foundational to the way decolonisation is theorised, at least in the arts and humanities today, which extends from a Latin American school of thinkers emanating out of revolutionary movements of the 1960s. There is, in this sense, a continuity in the line of thinking that connects directly to the social movements which fought to end empire itself. Secondly, it's for the very practical learnings that can be taken from Mignola's definition. He necessitates engagement with others who are working towards similar ends. He also underlines the importance of an entanglement between thinking and doing, that is not accepting the segregation of thought and practice, and the need to enact theories and to moreover theorise what we do. And there's also this imperative of putting life before institutions. Now, as with all decolonial work, this might be read in line with the highest stakes of all. Lives are being lost at this very moment due to existing colonial warfare, which exists as a smokescreen to the protection of institutions. But there is also the relatively minor, but nonetheless related work of organisations who seem very far removed from the work of colonial governments, whose existence relies in no small part on the colonial matrix of power, as Mignola puts it. When we think about decolonisation in our respective contexts, we have to think about how cultural organisations like universities, museums, cinemas and galleries exist within a wider ecology of coloniality. Akili Mbembe approaches the decolonisation of universities and museums in shared terms, arguing that it involves the radical refounding of our ways of thinking and a transcendence of our disciplinary divisions. And to me, this sounds a lot like the kind of pluralistic thinking that was mobilised for the third waves of the 1990s, which ultimately culminated in a widespread championing of interdisciplinarity, which was subsequently proclaimed within the neoliberal university. However, Mbembe departs from here not to talk about ways of capitalising on untapped resources, but instead to discuss the recapitalisation, as he puts it, of institutions. He describes a bridge between the way an institution is defined epistemologically and the way an institution makes money. Confronting and challenging this relationship would appear to be the work of decolonisation for Mbembe. It also describes a gap that so often exists between the increasingly sophisticated theorisation of decolonisation as a set of ideas and the kinds of material changes required within colonised or post-colonised territories. It's a gap which has and will continue to preoccupy all those doing decolonial work today. Now, the UK's Museums Association, which is apparently the oldest body for convening national museums in the world. Today, rather than a rootedness in more traditional ideas of national heritage, the organisation foregrounds campaigns including anti-racism, decolonising museums, and museums for climate justice. It's published 10 decolonising principles. Challenging neutrality, which is one, sounds promising. Its description of decolonisation as an ethical commitment, and its final principle of aiming for justice is perhaps less promising. We might ask, are we able to more clearly define the terms decolonisation must take in specific areas? Is doing the work more than a goodwill gesture? It is perhaps surprising that a more systematic strategy for what and how has not yet arisen within cultural institutions. Moreover, where such attempts have been made, we might moreover question the lack of connectivity between strategic approaches. If collaboration across organisations within even the same industries is lacking, it's difficult to foresee the kinds of intersectoral collaboration which will be necessary to realise concrete social and geopolitical changes. Institutions are often tasked with reconciling the radical demands of progressives with the imperial nostalgia which is prevalent through much of their loyal membership. And of course, even more significant is the network of financiers often maintaining the status quo behind the scenes. For all the work that needs to be done in the museums and galleries context, things are at least happening. And the same could not necessarily be said for the UK film industry. Now, the British film industry itself emerged as both strategy and symptom of imperial expansion. I'm drawing here from the writing of Lee Grieverson from his book on Empire of Film. The UK government of the interwar period invested, Grieverson says, in culture through the creation of the Empire Marketing Board, which established economic networks within the imperial bloc and the Conservative government's tariffs on non-British films. It was within this system the Colonial Film Unit of the 1920s, the General Post Office Film Unit of the 1930s, and the Crown Film Unit of the 1940s produced propaganda documentaries on the remarkable achievements of empire. In many cases, refining what would become known as the colonial gaze in films like One Family, Windmill in Barbados, Cargo from Jamaica, and Song of Ceylon. Bearing in mind this rootedness in wider imperial policy, we might ask, is the film industry engaged in deeper consideration of this legacy? Let's set aside decolonial practices for now and consider just decolonial discourse. The lack of a decolonial or anti-colonial concern within the public face of Creative England, Screen Scotland, Film Cambry, or Northern Ireland Screen reflects these debates. Search for colonial or imperial too, and you'll be left frustrated. These are organisations tasked with representing and engaging the national film industries comprising the United Kingdom. Yet their websites, at least, appear to communicate zero consideration of empire or its legacy. A legacy which these institutions, as part of a massive industry, have been constructed. Moreover, there's no consideration of the privilege the UK's national film industries enjoy through their colonial inheritance. There is no mention of ongoing colonial campaigns through which they or many of their collaborators have profited from. This simply reflects the total absence of policy related to coloniality in the wider strategic governance of the British Film Institute. In its 10-year plan published in 2023, the BFI named 6 ambitions: diversifying audiences, embracing a wider screen culture, reframing the public's relationship with the nation's screen heritage, growing digital heritage, long-term strategies for education and skills, and growing the cultural and economic impact of the UK film industry. Now, I'm sure we can all think of ways that each of these might be approached in the wider context of coloniality, but nothing. While it continues to be scrutinised, the BFI, like the wider British creative industries, has foregrounded racial inequalities within the broader category of diversity. But the complete disregard for questions of coloniality represents a systemic neglect for the deep political and economic foundations from which racial discrimination emerges. These systems remain integral to the hierarchies of global capitalism, and they do have material consequence within the film industries. Failing to decolonise or even interrogate the way film industry mechanisms are governed might only work to reinforce the obstacles denying access for people from colonised or post-colonial places. It will ensure knowledge remains determined by Eurocentrism, whiteness, and imperial nostalgia. This is not to disregard altogether the financial resource which has been made available by the BFI through mechanisms like the Global Screen Fund, and the Screen Heritage Fund, which emphasises diversification and inclusivity in its selection. In December 2020, the BFI Film Audience Network's Inclusive Cinema Group published a toolkit titled Dismantling Structural Inequality in Your Cinema. The guide was framed in the context of the burgeoning Black Lives Matter protests and wider institutional stances which had proliferated in the summer of 2020. In March 2024, with funds from the BFI Film Audience Network, the Glasgow Short Film Festival clearly emphasised decolonial themes in its programme. This included the strand towards liberation, amongst which a programme of Palestinian short films was accompanied by a live performance by a British Palestinian musician. 50% of ticket sales from the Palestine event was donated to medical aid for Palestinians. Such mechanisms for foregrounding decoloniality within instruments of film exhibition and distribution remain few and far between. And it's my hope that today we might encounter new ways of thinking this relationship as we work towards a deeper understanding of film itself within the larger colonial matrix of power. I want to return to Mignolo to highlight three crucial concepts embedded within his argument, which I think can be directly applied to the film industry. These concepts are collaboration, praxis, and what we might call decentering or recentering, depending on how we view things. These are three concepts which should underpin the strategic work of decolonisation within institutions. To take seriously a continuing engagement with decolonisation, collaboration is required with other organisations working across different modes and methods. These collaborations must be led by a systematic programme of thought which is in turn enacted and revised in relation to its material circumstances, what we might call praxis. And to decentre the institutional priorities of those in power towards or back towards the people to whom they are supposed to be accountable, this would be a decolonial imperative. We might go further still here and question who said people are, and bring the theoretical demarcation of decolonisation more into line with its historical actuality, that is to recentre and prioritise the needs and participation of marginalised groups. I'll pick up these three concepts so as to frame some priorities for thinking about decolonisation in the film industry, specifically its channels of exhibition and distribution. So to what extent do the arenas in which film is programmed engage with legacies of colonialism? How do curators working across often segmented areas of the cultural and creative industries engage notions of coloniality? And in spaces where films are screened, to what extent do these wider questions play a role in their framing and reception? These are questions circulating in the background of today's presentations and our wider discussions. These questions have already been broached outside of the UK context too. Brazilian film programmer Natalia Cristofonetti has spoken of the need to forge new categories, new criteria, and assume blind spots, and have a predisposition to decentering. Berenia describes her practice as a film curator and programmer as a role that is very gatekeepery, and asks, how can I look beyond what is legitimised? How can I recognise other ways of doing? How can I displace the notion of judgment, especially universalist judgment, in favour of that of recognition? I'd rather be a gate opener than a gatekeeper, Berenia says. Writing about Malayali diasporic media in the Middle East and Gulf, Darshana Sridharmini discusses the Nottingham Film Festival in Kuwait, which includes a technical workshop which allowed a dialogic conversation, Mimi says, on what worked in terms of conceptualisation and execution of projects, arguing the festival has offered them an opportunity to work towards a collective filmmaking experience. The films reflect their struggles with life and the use of cinematic media to weave narratives around events, people and situations. And writing in response to the 2021 Berlinale's thematic focus on decolonising cinema, Lindiwe Govey and Estrella Sendra described their witnessing of a reorientation in terms of hierarchies, with the participants from different African contexts speaking from their own locations on their own terms about their inspiring work and thereby situating the Berlinale as a somewhat parochial interlocutor on the margins. We'll hear later from Australia Centre with Sheila Petty about their groundbreaking Decolonising Film Festivals project and some of the practical resources emerging out of that work. To close in, I'd like to once again thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to participate in today's workshop. I'm especially thankful to our speakers, and I'm looking forward to their fascinating presentations, as well as some further dialogue with you all about their themes and issues. Thank you to our keynote speaker, Israel Cassi, co-founder of Tape Collective, who will be joining us to tell us about some of the vital work she's been doing with Tape in film programming. I will soon be joined by Ben Stoll and Antonio Rivera Aldos, both of whom are interested in the historical relationship between Empire, Africa, and alternative forms of film exhibition. First, though, I'm very happy to introduce our first panellists, Dr. Harvey and Dr. Lydia Hertford.